Good afternoon and welcome to the Conservancy's third and final session of our annual Biodiversity Symposium. I am Renee Bronca, the Director of Conservation Education and Outreach at Western Reserve Land Conservancy. We are Ohio's largest land trust, encompassing a 29-county region in Northeast Ohio. To date, we've protected over 80,000 acres of natural lands, family farms, and urban green spaces. At the Land Conservancy, I plan nature-based programming for people of all ages, the goal being to provide a platform for participants to learn and develop a greater appreciation of our natural world. I am pleased to continue this virtual symposium to aid in our understanding of the importance of biodiverse ecosystems, both in our home gardens and natural landscapes. I want to take a moment to thank Judy Semruk of Nature Spark for her ongoing collaboration in identifying potential speakers and timely topics for this series. She brings a deep knowledge, stays current on emerging trends, and is always generous in sharing ideas and insights. Thank you, Judy, for your continued partnership. I also want to thank Julie Slater from Meadow City Nursery for bringing today's topic to my attention. Many of us are familiar with pollinator-safe plants, but this deep dive will help us better understand how pesticide use is affecting insect communities and why greater awareness is so important. Ours is an audience that truly wants to do the right thing, and this program will help us become better stewards in our gardens. I enjoy moderating this series, and I'm already looking forward to topics we can cover next year. As I tell you, each time we meet, we all can play a role in creating sustainable, functioning ecosystems through our gardening practices and support of conservation. I want to take a moment and thank and recognize our sponsors who made it possible for us to organize this symposium and offer it for free this year. Thank you to the Ohio Division of Wildlife, Audubon Society of Greater Cleveland, Avonlea Gardens, Leaves for Wildlife, the Lake Erie Allegheny Partnership for Biodiversity, the Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District, Meadow City Nursery, Ohio Native Plants, which was formerly Ohio Native Plant Month, and Nature Spark. And remember, please use the Q&A feature to post your questions, and we'll address those following today's presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce Sharon Selvaggio for her program From Nursery to Nature, How to Find, Grow, and Collaborate for Pollinator-Safe Plants. Welcome, Sharon.
Thanks, Renee. It's truly a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm going to bring up my screen here.
Sounds good.
Um, so let's see. Okay, I always have to get the little Zoom window out of the way.
That's fine.
Okay, there we go. Okay, well, I'm really pleased to be with this pretty incredible group from Ohio. What a great organization that the Western Reserve Land Conservancy is, and all of you working together to help restore land. And I'm especially interested because I have a friend near Cleveland, Marcia Karsten, who really, I think actually Marcia's on the call today because
She
I learned.
is. I think I saw her log in, so that's
Oh,
great.
okay. Well,
Yeah.
Marcia really has been an inspiration to me as a gardener and restoration work, although I've never met her in person, but just through her story. And Marcia worked with Xerces, I think back in 2020, when we really began our early efforts to communicate our Be Safe Plants work. And we've come along a little bit since then. So I'm really pleased to and excited to tell you a little bit more about our program that we've been developing that has allowed us to source nursery plants that we believe are safe for both bees and butterflies, and how you can use these same methods to use in your own community so that you can also find and grow pollinator safe plants. So, a little bit about us. We're 54 years old this year. We're a nonprofit that focuses on the conservation of invertebrates. And that means restoring habitat for invertebrates. That's planting flowers, making sure that they've got everything they need from nesting materials and overwintering sites to water. It means protecting the most endangered and imperiled invertebrates and really tracking their status. And it means reducing the impact of pesticides, which are a major threat to invertebrates. And just briefly about me, I am a former wildlife biologist. I started my career in Western Oregon in the national forests out here. Later, I moved to the National Wildlife Refuge System in the Northwest. There was a lot of focus there on wetlands and prairies. And during the last 10 years of my career, I've been working exclusively on pesticide issues in the nonprofit sector. I got really interested about 10 years ago and decided to sort of make that the focus for the last part of my career. So I want to talk about three things today. I'm going to talk about why we should care about invertebrates, insecticides, the problem they are for bees and other pollinators, and then getting pollinator-safe plants. So let's jump in. First, about invertebrates. Why should we care? Well, invertebrates are animals without backbones. They comprise actually 90 to 97% of all animal species on the planet. And they're often tiny, they're inconspicuous, and literally below our feet. And they're a very diverse group. They include insects, spiders, mites, worms, mollusks like clams, crustaceans like crab, and other groups as well. And they are, as you know, mostly unloved and unnoticed, but nevertheless, they are the foundation of any healthy landscape, and they provide these services that we often don't think that much about. Pollination, more people are paying attention to that these days. Pest control, this is major. The world survived long before we came along through this balance between um, different levels of species, some that would eat and some that would be eaten. And there is a fine balance in nature wherever you look. Food for wildlife, this is part of this pest control. But if you care about birds, fish, and higher vertebrates, invertebrates provide, a huge source of food for these animals. They're really important in soil health. If we did not have decomposers breaking down all the dead things, dead plants, dead animals, even our own bodies eventually will be dead. But soil health is about converting all of those molecules back into usable molecules for other plants. Water filtration, we all need clean water. Invertebrates help perform this service. Finally, plant seed dispersal. Ants in particular are really important for this. So, in short, we cannot live without invertebrates. So today I'm going to focus in more on one group of invertebrates, pollinators, and we are experiencing a decline both globally and in the country of pollinator diversity and abundance. And although this is understudied, we do have enough data to know that for bumblebees, nearly a third of bumblebee species in the US are at some degree of extinction risk. For butterflies, we've got highly iconic species like the monarch that are really recently showing very rapid declines. Monarchs have declined by over 80% just since the 1980s. And then even broader groups like butterflies across the United States have recently been studied, and they're less numerous than they were just 20 years ago. Scientists have estimated that there are a fifth, 20% less, essentially, less butterflies now than just 20 years ago. And one of the primary drivers of invertebrate declines is habitat loss. All this farmland, developed land. And what we do in response, we work with partners to bring back that pollinator habitat on farms, in cities and towns. And, a good thing about pollinators is that their habitat doesn't need to be huge and extensive like you'd need for a large carnivore. Even small patches can make a difference. However, there's an additional challenge, and that's pesticides. These are viewed by scientists as a major driver of pollinator declines. Pesticides, which include herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, organically approved pesticides, and non-organically approved pesticides, things like rodenticides, those are all pesticides. And one thing we know about them is that they often move around away from where they're actually applied. So they can contaminate nearby habitats. And this contamination can actually degrade the ecological value of those habitats and reduce the benefit that those habitats might otherwise provide to pollinators. So let's zoom in now to focus on insecticides in particular and why they're a problem for bees and other invertebrates. First, one thing to know about pesticides in general. So pesticide use is really widespread. And in a sense, you cannot get away from pesticides. And as I mentioned before, this is partly because pesticides move, but also because the use is so dramatically widespread. This shows estimated agricultural use for clothianidin, one neonic. And although it is concentrated in the Midwest, where practically every inch of land had applications, when we see these wide areas, that doesn't necessarily mean that these areas don't have any pesticides. They might have different pesticides, and we know, in fact, because that's a whole huge project of mine, that there are a lot of pesticides applied to natural lands out west in the United States. Anyway, this is one example of a chemical that kind of shows how intensive the use can be in certain parts of the United States. But what we know is that pesticides as a group are applied to hundreds of millions of acres, and insecticide use is linked to declines in wild bees and butterflies. Now, remember back to the early 1990s, if you were alive? I was beginning my career at that time. I didn't even have kids yet. But since the early 90s, the overall volume of insecticides applied to crops in the US has actually declined. It's a good thing, right? However, the total toxicity to insects has more than tripled. That's sort of like if you were to look at a map of, say, heat index, and that the square mile of land that you live in has gotten hotter and hotter over the last 40 years. Well, it's basically the same thing with pesticides. The toxicity in any square mile of the United States has actually risen over time, tripled over 35 years. And this increase is largely coming from the neonics that are driving this. This is neonicotinoids, a group of highly toxic, long-lived insecticides that are shown here in blue. Now, neonics came on the market in the 1990s, and their use exploded in the early 2000s. To focus in a bit more, about 25% of our insecticide use is in residential settings, homes and yards. And in some places, it's quite a bit higher. There was a study out of Georgia that showed that about 64% of homeowners used insecticides. There was a survey from Ohio from about 10 years ago that found that 62% of homeowners applied chemicals to their lawns. Now, in that case, it also included fertilizers, so I can't drill down just to insecticides there. But essentially, the use of insecticides is quite common, whether you're in agriculture or residential settings. Now, in residential settings, people are using insecticides for mosquitoes, for ticks, for spiders and ants, maybe other pests. And some of these are possibly public health risk pests, some are not. They might be just nuisance pests. And these insecticides affect more than just the target pests. So we've been concerned about the effect of mosquito sprays on bees for years, but now we actually have data that shows that these sprays are indeed very risky for bees, especially the commercial pest control service kinds that homeowners will often contract for or have on a regular basis. A recent study that we did that was just published earlier this year showed that those commercial pesticide sprays can leave lethal levels of insecticides in treated yards, 6 times above lethal levels for honeybees, actually. I'm going to skip over the details of that, but if we have time at the end, I can let you know more about what we found with that study. Oh, and Renee, I mentioned that you can interrupt me if we have questions that come up along the way. So,
Sure thing. Sounds good. Thanks, Sharon.
okay. So I'll move on to the Getting Pollinator-Safe plants, which sort of designed to be the heart of this presentation, but I can go on these offshoots about mosquitoes and things like that. But let's think about this, because I know a lot of you are working on restoration. I believe a lot of you probably are doing that in your home gardens as well as on these larger landscapes, like with the Conservancy. And if we are really working to support these restored landscapes, and we know about the importance of native plants for all the wildlife that we're trying to support, including native invertebrates, how do we find plants that are safe for native pollinators? specifically those that don't contain pesticides at levels that we know are harmful. So here, I'm interested in finding out more about who's in the audience. And so Renee has a poll that she's going to launch just to find out who's here today. Renee, do I need to exit? I can just stay on. It looks like I can. So if you can take a minute to answer the questions here, and then Renee will report the results.
Oh my goodness. Okay, here we go. 96% of the folks said yes to having bought plants in the last 3 years. It's split 50-50 on regular plant buyers for restoration, landscape, and commercial projects. And then 90% said no to do you work in the nursery industry or grow plants for sale to others? So there you have it.
Okay, well, that's great to know because I've got some information for all of you. And hopefully you'll find the rest of my presentation applicable to your work.
Yeah.
So let me review a little bit of market research first. In 2022, Americans spent 10.8 billion on plantings to support pollinators and other wildlife in and around their homes. Now that is as much as people spent on Black Friday in 2024. We know Black Friday is the biggest shopping day of the year, so there is demand here. And this demand is for native plants, it's for pollinator plants, it's for sustainably produced plants. Specifically, the demand for native plants is really growing. In 3 years, 2021 to 24, 12% up. For pollinator plants, there are more than a quarter of US adults that have purchased just in 24 plants with pollinators. And for sustainably produced plants, this is really interesting because the demand for that is also up. People are thinking about various kinds of sustainable plant production, including recycling, use of water. But among sustainably produced plants that were specifically asked about in this study, bee-friendly methods are top of mind. Consumers will pay $1.52 more per plant for bee-friendly methods, and this is more than what they're willing to pay for any other sustainability practice. So this is really interesting and relevant stuff, especially if you're a nursery or a buyer. And thinking about your customers, if you are somebody who supplies plants to homeowners or to commercial projects, and of course for restoration. So people are helping with biodiversity solutions, which is great news, and this is increasing. Still, we know that the floriculture and nursery sector actually uses more pesticide per acre than field food crops in the United States. And this can be problematic because there've been a number of studies that look at what kind of residues are left on nursery plants. And there's typically multiple pesticides, and sometimes the concentrations of those pesticides are actually high enough in certain toxic insecticides to kill bees or butterflies. Now, insecticides can be really harmful on their own. Fungicides can be as well, and I'll talk about that in a minute. They can also be more harmful in combination because some fungicides can actually slow down the detoxification or breakdown of insecticides. And so, fungicides are not innocuous, especially if they're used together with certain kinds of insecticides, pyrethroids and neonics being two of the groups that are of particular concern. Just an aside here, part of my presentation is going to mention some technical names. There's going to be some charts here and there and some scientific studies. I'm willing to share my presentation afterwards. If you're confused by anything I say and want to look at it more closely later, I can send a PDF. Finally, in the nursery industry, there are systemic pesticides used often. These are the kinds of pesticides that basically are absorbed by the plant, and that they can move throughout the plant, protecting the whole plant, right? But at the same time, those systemic insecticides are ending up in leaf tissue that might be eaten by a caterpillar or pollen or nectar that's consumed by a bee. And some of these systemic insecticides can really linger in plants. Once they're inside the plants, they can even linger for months or years after an application. And we've seen this particularly in woody plants. So these are some concerns that we have about pesticides that end up in nursery plants that we then buy for home garden landscapes or restoration projects. So we want to bring nature home, we want to restore, but we need to think about, which pesticides are on or in the plants that we buy, how hazardous are they? And the most important question, how can I find pollinator-safe plants? So we grapple with this as an organization because we buy a lot of plants ourselves. So these questions are the crux that lead to the solutions that I want to talk about today. But again, little sidetrack here. Before I go there, we wanted to know because there had been several studies that looked at pesticides on nursery plants and the risks specifically that they pose for bees. We were curious about what kind of risk there was to monarchs and were they being impacted if milkweed plants were being sold also with pesticide residues. So we undertook a study, recruited a bunch of volunteers from across the country, sourced 235 plants from 33 different retailers of different sizes all around these areas, and sent them off to a lab. And what we found was that overall there were 61 different pesticides. This included herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. On average, each plant contained 12.2 different pesticides per plant, but the range was 2 to 28. These were only milkweed plants, and this was sort of a one-time survey. So it just captured a snapshot in time of what we were finding, the plants we bought in 2021. But that range was particularly interesting because it suggested that maybe different settings impact like the pesticide application choices that nurseries are making. Or maybe there's a range of philosophies and practices amongst growers and possibly retailers that are making that difference. Certainly, we saw that some were successfully growing milkweeds with very few pesticides, while others are offering plants with more than 24 pesticides. So, zeroing in a little bit more on the risk of those, we saw that some plants had, well, basically for insecticides and fungicides, we saw a similar curve for each. Some had a lot, some had few, but essentially there was this average. And the most common scenario was 1 to 2 insecticides in each plant. That was the most common, although the average was 2.8, and 6 fungicides per plant. And we did see a pattern that milkweeds that were purchased from larger retailers were associated with both a higher number of pesticides and more different kinds of pesticides. So that tells you a little bit about, the diversity of what we found. So what did it mean for monarchs in terms of how toxic any of these chemicals were? Well, at the time, Only 9 out of those 61 different chemicals had been tested on monarchs previously to find out how they reacted to these pesticides. And so we had a limited data set to draw from, but we did find data on some of the pesticides that we detected in these plants. And we did find that 38% of our samples had concentrations of strobin fungicides that had previously been associated with monarchs growing into smaller adults, specifically shorter wing lengths. And this was a concern because a separate study had correlated wing length with migratory ability in monarchs. And of course, monarchs undertake this huge, spectacular migration, and we were concerned about whether this might possibly make a difference. So, fungicides have been documented as issues in other studies for pollinators. They rarely outright will kill insects, but they can result in a lower lifespan, essentially, both for larvae and adults. They can also result in lower chrysalis weights for butterflies. And as I mentioned before, fungicides, some of them can slow the breakdown of insecticides in the pyrethroid and neonic groups, which basically means that these toxic insecticides, if they're in the plants as well, they'd be in the plants longer if they're in there in combination with these kinds of fungicides. Now, an additional finding is that 69% of the milkweeds contained highly toxic and persistent systemic insecticides. These are higher risk. And on average, there were 1.6 higher risk insecticides per plant, some at very high concentrations. And unfortunately, this shows how common these insecticides can be on plants that consumers are buying, even plants that are well known, like milkweeds, for their value to iconic insects like monarchs. So what we found most commonly were these 6 chemicals. This shows how frequently they were detected in plants and whether or not they were higher risk. The yellow shows the ones that were higher risk. So we were finding higher risk chemicals between, well, actually, there were more that were lower. I just didn't want to have a chart that was too long here. But of the 6 top, between 23 and 40% of the plants contained at least one higher risk, chemical. Um, so as I mentioned originally, we didn't have much toxicity data to rely on to really understand how the pesticides that we were finding might be affecting monarchs specifically. But a publication actually led to another study out of University of Florida by a woman named Bernadette Mock. She tried to gather some of that data. She sprayed common systemic insecticides that are used in the nursery trade on milkweeds grown in Florida. She let the plants sit for 2 weeks outside, which is how they grow them in Florida, under shade cloth. And then after they had sat for 2 weeks, which allowed the pesticides to degrade from these foliar applications, that's what we call when you spray the leaves directly, she placed monarch caterpillars on the plants. And then she watched to see what happened. And she found that as she watched those caterpillars and their development and chrysalis and adulthood, that 5 of those synthetic insecticides she tested killed monarchs, even though there had been a 2 week time lapse between the spray being applied and the caterpillars being placed on the plants. So I don't have data. This was really a concern, first of all, because these 3 that are asterisked right here were also found in our study. And you can see that 80% died for flopyrodifurone and imidacloprid. Imidacloprid is neonic. And 40% died with acetamiprid, which is also neonic. There were others were very high, even 100% died. Now, how common are these chemicals in the nursery sector? I don't have data for Ohio, but in California, which does publish pesticide use information, and you can filter it by sector. Imidacloprid, which is a neonic, is the number one chemical insecticide used in the nursery and floriculture industry in California. That is according to data from the California Department of Pesticide Regulation and by acreage. And so this is a concern. You know, some of these are not exceedingly common, but they're still in the top 20 or the top 10. I guess I'm sorry. I'm just going to go back for a second. This top line that they linger is really the one of the concerns is that we have to think about how long some of these pesticides last on plants. And so, what are some effective solutions? We've just documented a difficult challenge. Pesticide use happens in nurseries. It's an agricultural industry. Even iconic plants like milkweeds are probably going to get some pesticide applications. These can end up lasting on the plants. The residues might be dangerous to monarchs or to bees. And, but being real, this is a difficult problem for nurseries. How does a nursery balance their plant production, which they need to stay in business as a nursery, with pollinator safety, when often the consumer is demanding perfect looking plants? And there's a lot of damaging pests and disease that might be present. For milkweed, aphids, milkweed bugs, these are common pests. So, how do you, as a buyer, find pollinator safe plants? How do nurseries essentially meet this challenge and solve this challenge? So, I'm going to talk about some effective solutions that we've been piloting. While we're still in the middle of this, and we're going to learn more as years go by. So far, some of the things that I'm going to suggest are starting to work, and we think others, including yourselves, can adopt these solutions as well. So, just a little background as part of our pollinator restoration work, since 2019, we've been distributing habitat kits to people. These are free native pollinator attractive plants. For the most part, we've been giving these to projects that are on working lands, such as farms and ranches, or community lands, such as libraries or city gardens. Um, and these have been distributed across the United States. And in those years, we've purchased more than 600,000 plants from nurseries. We're working with around 3 dozen nurseries at this time. When we started this, we wanted to make sure people had the right species, the right ecotypes, and that's what we were focused on initially, primarily. However, as this program grew, we put into place a comprehensive process for ensuring that the plants that we buy would also be as safe as possible for the pollinators that we're working to restore. So how do we do this? First, we talk to our nurseries. We talk to them about their pest management and pesticide practices. This is a really useful step for us. Some nurseries are surprised by this, but most nurseries are very willing to sit down with what we call an interview with us. We ask some in-depth questions, and through this, we gain very useful information about their practices. We learn, for one thing, about how they're handling some of those specific problematic pests, whether it's an insect pest or a disease pest. And as I said, nurseries are in a tough spot often when it comes to pesticides because most consumers want healthy looking plants without bugs on them. And so they have to figure out ways to manage this. Now, management in any system of pests is really a question of integrated pest management. So we prioritize purchases from nurseries with robust integrated pest management practices. What does this mean? This means that to the extent that a nursery practices prevention methods that keep the conditions that would foster those pests from outbreaking, essentially, that this is sort of the best, the first line of defense. Monitoring is important, scouting, basically keeping an eye on the plants and having in place systems and protocols and trained staff that basically are on the alert. It's kind of like having a sentinel at night if you are out there, and you've got a war party I'm sorry, that's probably not a good metaphor, but if you really needed to keep an eye out for a danger, monitoring is really important, being vigilant. And then we look at how nurseries actually limit the pesticide harm, the choice of pesticides, when they decide to use them, how they target any pesticide use that they do use. So all of this is described in this offering Be Safe Plants, a guide for nurseries. I've put it a link here. Um, and at the end, I'll also show where you can find. I'm going to share a number of resources. Most of them have QR codes. I guess I did not put a QR code with this one. But um, uh, if you are the kind of person that likes to take a picture of QR codes, get your camera ready because I've got a few coming up. Um, so another solution that we put into place that's been working very well for us is contract growing with nurseries and asking that they avoid the most harmful pesticides to protect both adult and larval bees and adult butterflies and their caterpillars. So specifically, we ask our contract grow nurseries to avoid certain systemic insecticides entirely, 22 of them, on the plants, on the soil, or through the chemigation system throughout the growing period while they're contract growing our particular plants. We also ask that they avoid several dozen other pesticides or disallow those the last 2 weeks before we take possession. Now, we do try to be flexible and we tell nurseries if there, is a reason why you can't follow all of this, but you can follow most of this, we're certainly willing to work with you. I'll talk on the next slide about the results that we've had. Now, could you do this too? I think, of course, anyone who uses contract grows can follow this process, especially large buyers like restoration organizations, cities, campuses, or groups that coordinate plant purchases, conservation districts, and of course, the growers themselves. So you can look at the specific pesticides of concern in our fact sheet supplying pollinator-safe nursery plants, which is linked here with this QR code. So as of this date, we have 13 nurseries across the country that have agreed to grow for us and have been growing using these specifications. And some feedback from nurseries who've been producing for us a little longer that we've heard so far is that the cost did not increase. One nursery chose voluntarily to use the same standard of growth for pollinator plants they were growing for another organization, not just for what they were growing for Xerces. Some nurseries have told us they needed to put into place new logistical and communication efforts so that they could clearly distinguish between plants that they were growing for nurseries with stricter policies as opposed to plants they were growing for others. One nursery even told us it was a relief to have this kind of structure to rely on to have a better understanding of what the most problematic pesticides were for pollinators and the application timing. And in fact, I'm doing another presentation on the 24th, I think, through the Minnesota Pollinator Friendly Alliance, and that nursery will be talking at that. So if you're interested in hearing directly from that nursery, sign up for Pollinator Friendly Alliance, and you can hear that nursery talk about the experience growing under this protocol that we have. But now, what if you don't have enough buying power to contract grow? What if you are just buying plants for your own home garden? You can still seek out pollinator-safe plants. Again, I have a QR code here. This links to our Buying Bee Safe Plants guide, which will help you. And if you break it down into simple steps, the best bet is first to seek out organic plants and seeds or plants that were grown with no insecticides and fungicides. These can be hard to find though, so I don't want you to be unrealistic about what's out there on the marketplace. So if you cannot find organically grown plants or pesticide free, and when I say pesticide, I'm really talking all kinds of pesticides, not just insecticides. That's an important question to ask when you're asking. If you can't find organic, look for neonic-free plants. Now, many retailers will know which of their suppliers are neonic-free. Many retailers will prioritize those suppliers. If they don't, you can ask them to get this information. And finally, you can ask about the steps the nursery takes to offer plants grown with pollinator-friendly pest management. This gets into that broader question of prevention, of monitoring, of limiting the pesticide harm, because we do know that beyond neonics, there are other pesticides of concern. So you'd be listening for that Venn diagram that I showed earlier, um, and talking about that. Now, this is a little bit of a challenge, so I'm going to talk about how to make this easier for yourself. Again, thanks to Marcia for this, because when we first started doing this, Marcia helped us really think about the approach. And so it's really important that you're willing to do this. So we want you to be bold, but it's so important to be friendly and to be informed when you first walk in. So you want to familiarize yourself. You want to approach with a smile, and you want to try to build a rapport. Now, you want to talk to the right person. Now, Marcia, I don't know if you know this, but a couple of years ago, we worked with our social media person who put together a series of Instagram reels, which are available on our website. You don't have to go to Instagram and search through, 800 posts to find these. You can find those posts at this QR code right here or at this link. And if at the end, I'm going to show a couple of them so you can kind of see them. I think these are really useful. They help you know how to approach, what questions to ask, and how to interpret and respond to the responses that you might get. So, as I said, I'll show a couple if we have time at the end, to give you a sense of what these look like. Now, organizing your community, if you are a small plant buyer or a homeowner by yourself, can really have a big payoff. First of all, you create more habitat, whether that's in your neighborhood or maybe that's a local space that you all work on together. You also have more leverage with nurseries if you're working as a group. And often you can buy plants cheaper that way if you have, a purchase of a large number of plants. So what does it look like to organize your community? Well, that can be as simple as bringing a friend or a neighbor when you decide, hey, I want to go out and buy some plants this weekend. Or you can organize your neighbors and friends into larger groups for plant purchases. So you can start organizing them now and say, hey, out in April, I'm going to be going plant shopping. What if my friend group here, if we all go together and we have 7 or 8 of us that go, and we could even schedule ahead of time to try to talk to this nursery so that when we're there, we can have this conversation. If you're a landscaper, maybe you'd work with a plant broker and give this information to your plant broker so that they can ask these questions. You can also work to make sure that larger organizations that you're a part of, like your city, your park service, your county, landscaper associations, professional groups, and things like that, that they're aware of these ways to find pollinator-safe plants. You could even work on policy, for instance, to commit your city to pollinator-safe plant purchases. One other possible tip, this is intuitive, this is or based upon anecdotal observation, not evidence at this point. But it seems that when nurseries hold plants longer, grow them bigger, they're more likely to use pesticide over the lifespan of that plant, based on my conversations. So buying smaller plants when possible might not be a bad idea. Again, I don't have scientific evidence for this based on observation. Smaller plants usually establish better, easier to dig a planting hole. Um, and so, take that for what it's worth. If you're not sure, you may want to protect your plants. You can net plants, and smaller plants are also easier to net for the first year just to let any pesticides decline. So we'd love it if you could let us know how this is going for you. If you're going to put into place any of these various options that I've given to you, I'd love it if you could later on, and again, I'll share this, but visit this forum The link is here, and here's a QR code to tell us about the action that you took. I would give me more information. It's anonymous. You do not have to give your name or your email. You can. There's a space for that if you want. But we would kind of just want to know, how are people putting this into place? What kind of experience are they having? We have a new video that, especially for nursery owners and people who want to understand the nursery industry a little bit more from the inside. This features three nurseries and some of the ways in which they put some of this into place. This is everything from a small native plant nursery in Santa Fe to a very large commercial nursery out in Oregon. You can take a look at this at our website. And so the takeaways, again, there's just a really increasing market for native pollinator attractive and sustainably grown plants. And consumers are willing to pay more for bee-friendly production. And we know that concerning pesticide residues have been found repeatedly, even in pollinator attractive plants. And so native plant buyers and producers are such important partners in pollinator conservation, and we all have room to improve, and every nursery and every buyer can contribute just by taking a few simple steps if possible. Our own experience shows that growers are making even our very stringent procedures work. And honestly, we were nervous about this. I'll be honest. It felt like a lot to ask. We set a very high bar. And we have been very pleasantly surprised to find out that nurseries are willing to do this, to tell us what their experiences are, and to make it work. So we encourage everybody to consider adopting the guidance that I've showed today, supplying pollinator-safe nursery plants for those larger buyers and for nurseries, and for smaller purchasers to use our Buying Bee Safe Plants Guide. And here's an email that you can reach me or one of my coworkers at, pesticides@xerces.org. I want to say thank you. We're a donor-supported nonprofit. We couldn't do any of this work without all of our members and the foundations and partners who support our work. So thank you. And if you want to be part of this, you can also become a member at that link. And you can contact me again if you've got any questions or follow up, or you just want to have a conversation. I'm always loving to talk to people. You can reach me through that email address. And okay, this is more on the mosquito study. I am going to skip this for a minute and show you those videos. But if we have time later and if there's interest, I can go back and talk about that. So I'm going to stop sharing, but I'm going to share again and share the reels really quickly.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
Now I I'm taking a little bit of a risk here because these are videos, and depending upon people's connectivity, um, it um
Might
um
not, it might not be smooth.
okay. Okay, it may or may not be smooth. But essentially, if you go to let me get off the Zoom and see if I can. Oh, okay. It's just looking funny on my screen. Oh, okay.
There we go.
Um,
Now it looks
okay, there
better.
we go. Okay.
Hmm.
This page basically has all the links that I have showed today, this Be Safe Nursery Plants. You
Hmm.
can just Google Xerces Be Safe Nursery Plants if you want to find anything that I've talked about today.
And I
Um,
plan on sharing out a lot of the links you shared with us today too. I always do a follow-up email after all the events. So
oh, that's so great.
yeah.
Thank you, Renee.
Hmm. Yeah, you bet.
So this second box down here is watch short videos with examples of how to talk to your nursery. So if you
Hmm.
click on that, it starts out with text. It's a blog here, but all of our reels are shown here. There's about 6 or 7 of them. So I'm going to skip over the first couple.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm going to show these some that are in the middle, and there's more
Hmm.
below the ones. But here's what questions should I ask nursery staff to find out if their plants are safe for pollinators. So I'm going to try this. If
Sure,
it does
sure.
not work, I apologize
No,
in advance, but it'll only take a couple minutes.
sounds good. It's too slow.
It's too slow.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
We're not hearing it either. So
Okay. Okay.
yeah, that's
I will
okay.
stop. Yeah.
Folks can find it. I will send them a link. I encourage everybody to watch them so we can all approach people in the appropriate way to make it happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, we do have questions, Sharon.
Okay.
So we'll get to the Q&A portion of this program. How's
Let's do
that?
that. Yeah. That's
Okay.
great.
So here's someone asked a question. Can we get a source for the statistics on how much was spent on plants for pollinators? This is very powerful to getting more nurseries on board. So
Oh, the
you
dollar
must have mentioned, yeah.
dollar 52 more. Yes, it's actually at the bottom. The study citation is there, but I can
Okay.
send the full citation to you, Renee, and if you want to put
Yeah,
it, yeah,
that'd be excellent. I will
but
include that in my follow-up note for sure. That is
yeah.
a very good
Oh,
stat.
one other thing I forgot. That study is cited in the fact sheet supplying pollinator-safe plants. I know all of the fact sheets might be like, wait a minute, you've got buying, you've got offering, you've got supplying. They pretty much all start and the
Yeah.
same. But we did that kind of on purpose. But if you look for supplying pollinator-safe plants, that market research data is also summarized in that fact sheet.
Okay,
Yeah, but
sounds good.
also, yeah.
Okay, speaking to the neonics, I heard that the half-life of neonics in plants themselves is rather short, but that residue in the soil they grow can linger longer and can take up again by the plants, can be taken up again by the plants. Wondering if you can speak to this, Sharon.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. First of all, the EPA standardizes the way it has pesticides tested before it allows them to be on the market. And it's a soil test that is typically done. So we have that data for basically every pesticide. We have less data about how long pesticides last in plants because it's not a standardized part of the EPA process. But we have, universities will often do their own data, whether or not the government requires it or not. And from data sources like that, and from some manufacturer data, we know that neonics have been shown, the longest I know of, residues still found 14 years after an application in horse chestnut trees. Manufacturer data showed residues lasting 6 years in rhododendrons. Um, and there's many studies showing that neonics can last a year or more in plants. If you look for it's called How Neonics Kill Bees or How Neonicotinoids Kill Bees, I think. It's at our website, publications. You can find some of that data in that
Okay.
study in particular. Yeah, in
Okay.
that document.
So this person said it sounds like the entire growing cycle of pollinators are affected by systemic pesticides. So in all the stages, this will lead to unhealthy development of the pollinator? Question. Is that
So in all
true?
these states, can you just repeat the question? I'm
In
having
all the stages of presumably the pollinators' stages of life, will that lead
yeah.
to unhealthy development of the pollinator?
Yeah,
Seems
it
like
can
it.
vary. It can vary depending upon the pesticide and when it is consumed or when the insect comes in contact with it.
Okay.
And how much. So much depends upon the particulars. That kind of doing a broad brush here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about what you found regarding pesticide use in growers versus retail nurseries?
Yeah, we bought all the plants at retail.
Okay.
Um, Most of these nurseries were not growing these particular plants themselves. They were grown by wholesalers. In a couple of cases, the garden centers were also growing the plants. So we most of the time knew who the wholesaler was and knew who the retailer was, but we did not know at what point the pesticide was applied. We also didn't know, couldn't prove that it was deliberately applied. We found some pesticides on these plants that are not registered in nursery use. We think that they probably came through the water. Now, that wasn't the case for those high risk insecticides that I showed you. All of those are registered for use in the nursery. But we found things, especially some of the herbicides that we would not have expected to see. There were a couple of insecticides that are basically labeled for termite use. So they might have been applied like in a nursery with wooden structures,
Hmm.
and they may have found their way onto plant tissue but not been applied directly. So
Okay.
we can't, all we know is that they ended up on the plant somehow. We don't know if they came through the water, if they came from direct application, if they were even sprayed on the milkweed directly, if they sort of drifted through the air and landed on the milkweed. But it
Okay.
does show you that there is vulnerability in
Hmm.
the nursery setting. Yeah.
Okay. So there's not a lot to elaborate on this question, but someone said, could we talk about mosquitoes? Mhm.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if you have any information. They said, I would love to have the mosquito information mentioned as well, so I can share that out as well.
Yeah.
But I guess maybe they're curious, is there any way to safely control mosquitoes if you have like a problem in your yard?
Yeah. Mosquitoes are really, a highlighted, public health pest.
Mhm.
One thing to know is that not all mosquitoes pose public health risk. Quite a lot of them don't. Um, that said, we know that, they're annoying and people would rather not be bitten by a mosquito. Um, there are really the best way. Again, it goes back to that Venn diagram of prevention. It's what we call source reduction. So if you have any containers or receptacles on your property, and gutters are a huge one that would store water essentially during the mosquito breeding season. So clean your gutters, get everything out of there so that they're draining and not holding water. If you've got plant, like those little things that you put underneath plants to hold water, if the water sits for 4 days, a mosquito can breed in it. So you want to dump those things and be on the lookout, especially if you live in a humid, wet climate. So source reduction is really a number one thing.
Okay.
Um, yeah, there's ways you can protect yourself, obviously, with clothing and certain kinds of other, kind of local, candles and things like that. But source reduction is number one.
So that's great, Sharon. And she did sort of clarify the question a little bit more. She's curious on ways to better address this in her community without offending the people who want this service. So maybe things that can be said to dissuade them from wanting the spraying service. And I'm just curious, what do you think about those things that people put in their pools to sort of, kill larvae in water
Yeah.
sources? Yeah.
BTI is that chemical that is basically it's a bacillus, it's a microorganism that
Uh-huh.
basically kills the developing larvae. It is a
Okay.
very targeted approach, and if you're using it in an artificial pond, it would be less harmful essentially to the environment than spraying insecticides on the vegetation as a barrier spray. So
Hmm.
certainly that is a much better approach to use those mosquito dunks.
Okay.
Um, as far as community approaches, we did not find that the residues that were left behind by municipal sprays reached lethal levels for bees. That's not to say that they couldn't cause chronic impacts. In other words, like wouldn't outright kill bees, but it could mean that their development might be slowed or something like that. We just don't have data right now. But the best thing is to work with a municipality they'll usually put into place prevention methods like trying to measure larvae out in native wetlands and doing source reduction on their own. So we have a number of different resources I can share on mosquito management within your community. So I'm happy to share those links too.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
And then, last question here. Any tips on starting a neighborhood garden club? And would the kits you mentioned qualify to help entice neighbors to possibly join?
Um, In some places, yes. Right now, I do not know if we actually are providing habitat kits in Ohio. We have programs that, we're a nonprofit, so it depends upon funding. We do have kits in Michigan, but if there is local interest, we could certainly look for local funding and try to develop a program in Ohio. As far as some of our programs are residential oriented, some of them are
Okay.
more working lands oriented, but there's always an opportunity to develop a program. So I can put you in touch with some of our Midwest people
Okay.
to talk, or I can basically provide their email so that or let them know. Anyway, one way or another, I'll put you in touch so that our
Sounds good.
Midwest people who develop those programs are aware that there might be an interest in Ohio.
Sounds wonderful. Well,
I'm
Sharon,
making
thank you.
some notes.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Go ahead. Thank you so much for being with us today. This was a wonderful program. We are going to wrap up our symposium for the year, and I thank everyone for attending all three sessions. And stay tuned. I always have other webinars that are coming up, and I will make sure you are informed about them. And I also shared the link to that Minnesota event that you mentioned when you were
oh,
talking
great.
to the Pollinator Alliance, and I will include that in my follow-up email as well. So again, thank you, Sharon, for sharing with us today, and everyone have a great day.
Much, Renee. Thank you, everybody. Really great to be here.